A few days ago, I found myself sitting through a public hearing for what should have been a simple local transit expansion. And for 4 grueling hours, the air was just thick with jargon. Stakeholder engagement, impact assessments, procedural equity. Everyone had a veto. Everyone had a grievance. And by the time they turned the lights out, the only thing that had actually been built was a mountain of billable legal hours. It felt like watching a giant try to tie its own shoelaces and just constantly tripping over the strings. But then I turned my attention to the news coming out of the East this January. While we were paralyzed by the aesthetics of bus stop, Beijing was rolling out its 15th five-year plan. And this document, it reads less like a political manifesto and more like a high-precision blueprint for a fortress. On the very day the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer touched down for his first visit in 8 years, he wasn't greeted by, a fellow debating society. He was walking into a civilization that has traded the war of words for the war of watts. The contrast was just jarring. On one side, you have a West drowning in its own Vitocracy, where even a bike lane requires a decade of litigation. On the other, a regime that treats $42 billion mega projects like routine maintenance. And it made me realize that Starmer's handshake wasn't just diplomacy, it was a quiet admission of reality. We've become a culture of managers and lawyers, while they've become a culture of engineers and builders. In the cold, hard logic of the physical world, the person who holds the wrench eventually dictates the terms to the person who holds the microphone. And it raises this terrifying question that most of us are too polite to ask. What happens to a civilization that loses the ability to move a single ton of earth without asking for permission from a committee first?
It is a terrifying question. And, frankly, it might be the only question that really matters right now.
Yeah.
That whole monologue just perfectly frames the divergence we're seeing in all the data we've pulled for this deep dive. We have a massive stack of documents in front of us today. I mean, everything from technical schematics on ultra-high voltage transmission to corporate autopsies of giants like Boeing, and even the raw text of that 15th five-year plan. And the story they all tell, it isn't really about politics in the traditional sense, red team versus blue team. It's about physics. It's about who can actually manipulate the material world, the steel, the concrete, the electrons, and who is just writing memos about it.
And that's exactly it. The physics of power. That's what I want to get into, because it feels like we've drifted into this headspace in the West where we think the economy is just numbers on a screen or that innovation is just a clever new app. But when you actually sit down and read these reports, you realize the economy is heavy. It has mass, it's steel, it's copper, it's energy generation. I want to start with a story that really stuck with me from the research because it grounds this whole abstract idea of power in something very, very tangible.
Yeah, please.
It's about this guy named Leek. You have to imagine a landscape where these massive silver towers are just marching across the horizon like silent giants. I was reading a field report about him. He's a young electrical engineer working on these UHVDC lines, and we'll definitely get into that acronym in a second, that stretch all the way from the windswept plains of Xinjiang to the humid factories on the coast. For this guy, Lee, state capacity isn't a theory. It's not a debate topic on a Sunday talk show. It's a grueling physical reality. He described what they call the Great Shift. And it's this coordinated national effort where they are laying thousands of miles of cable with the precision of a surgical strike.
It's the sheer scale of it that is just, it's hard to get your head around.
Exactly. And Leah talked about how his team operates within a singular national will. There's no town hall meeting to debate the color of the pylons. They just build. And I found myself thinking, it must feel incredibly strange, maybe even intoxicating, to be part of a machine that actually builds exactly what it draws on paper. As someone who tracks this stuff, I look at that, and even though the centralized power behind it feels totally alien to our systems, I feel this pang of professional envy. While we argue over the aesthetics of progress, people like Leah are literally rewiring the planet's energy map.
That envy is completely valid. It points directly to the first core concept we really need to unpack. State capacity as an engineering feat, not a political one. You mentioned UHVDC. That stands for ultra-high voltage direct current. And to understand why Lee's job is so significant and why the West is falling so far behind, you have to understand that in the world of electricity, this technology is the equivalent of upgrading from a dirt path to a maglev train.
Okay, let's pause right there on UHVDC and really break it down. I know what AC and DC are, basically. AC is alternating current, what comes out of my wall socket. DC is direct current, like in a battery. But why is the ultra-high voltage part the real game changer here? Why is this specific technology the backbone of their entire industrial engine?
It all boils down to a fundamental problem of physics, resistance. When you push electricity through any wire, The wire itself fights back. It creates heat. And that heat is lost energy. It's just waste, dissipating into the atmosphere. In the US and Europe, our grid is built on alternating current. Now, AC is fantastic for local distribution because it's really easy to step the voltage up and down with transformers. That's why Nikola Tesla, won the war of currents back in the 19th century against Edison's DC. It was perfect for the technology of 1890.
Right, AC won because you could easily lower the voltage to make it safe for a house. You don't want 1,000,000 volts coming out of your toaster.
But AC has a fundamental flaw that wasn't a huge problem a century ago. Over massive distances, and we're talking thousands of kilometers, AC loses a lot of power. It just bleeds off into the air as heat. Plus, you have really tricky synchronization issues. The frequency of the current has to be perfectly matched across the entire grid, or things, they literally blow up. Now, China had a geography problem that just brutally exposed this flaw. All their energy, the coal in the north, the massive wind farms in the Gobi Desert, the solar rays out west, is thousands of kilometers away from the factories in the mega cities in the east and south.
So they have the fuel in one place and the engine in a completely different one.
A perfect analogy. And trying to connect them with standard AC lines would be like trying to fill a swimming pool with a really leaky hose. By the time the power got from Xinjiang to Shanghai, a huge chunk of it would just be gone. So they bet the farm on UHVDC. Direct current doesn't have the same kind of losses over distance. It flows steadily. And when you crank the voltage up to ultra levels, we're talking 1.1 million volts, you can push massive amounts of power with incredible efficiency.
1.1 million volts. I mean, that number is genuinely hard to wrap my head around. My wall socket here is, 120 volts?
It's almost an astronomical figure. To give you a real sense of scale, you have to look at the Changji-Guquan line. This is just one of their UHVDC lines. This single transmission line carries 12 gigawatts of power.
12 gigawatts?
12 gigawatts. That is enough electricity to power the entire country of Ireland, down a single power line. And it stretches over 3,000 kilometers. Which is, for context, roughly the distance from Seattle to Chicago. And here's the kicker. They didn't just build one as a prototype. Between 2009 and 2025, they operationalized over 20 of these massive circuits. They have effectively built a national supergrid.
That comparison to the U.S. is where this gets, it gets depressing for me. I was looking at the timeline for the Transwest Express project here in the States. It's a very similar idea that bring wind power from Wyoming down to the Southwest. It's logical, it's necessary for the grid, but I looked at the dates. It took 15 years just to get the permits.
15 years?
15 years of paperwork before a single shovel could hit the ground. My kid could have been born, gone through all of K-12 and started driving in the time we spent arguing about whether to build the line. Meanwhile, the sources say China builds an equivalent line in 2 to 3 years, start to finish.
And that right there is the Vitocracy in action. It's a term that was coined by the political scientist Francis Fukuyama, but we are seeing it manifest in pure engineering terms. In the West, we've created a system where the process has become more important than the outcome. We have all these fragmented regulatory bodies, local, state, federal, environmental agencies, historical preservation societies, and every single one of them has a veto.
Just a giant stack of no's.
It's a no machine. Exactly. In the West, a project like Transwest Express has to undergo an environmental impact statement, an EIS, that can run thousands and thousands of pages. Then it gets sued by a local conservation group. Then a private landowner with a parcel on the route sues. Then the State Utility Commission demands a 5-year review of the cost-benefit analysis. It is literally death by 1,000 cuts. In China, once the 5-year plan, whether it's the 15th or its predecessors, says we are moving power from west to east, the entire state apparatus aligns to clear the path. They call it the West-East Power Transfer Strategy. They treat the entire country as a single circuit board. If a mountain is in the way, they tunnel through it. If a village is in the way, they move the village.
And this matters for more than just keeping the lights on in factories, right? I mean, if you care at all about the green transition, which every politician in the West claims to, you have to care about this. Because you can build all the solar panels you want in the Mojave Desert, but if you can't get that power to Los Angeles or New York, it's just shiny glass sitting in the sand.
That is the critical bottleneck of the entire energy transition. It's the part nobody wants to talk about because it's not glamorous. The West talks a very big game about a green future, but we have a transmission crisis. We have enormous renewable potential that is stranded. It's physically isolated because we cannot build the power lines to carry it. China has effectively solved this bottleneck through sheer physical construction. They're integrating massive amounts of renewable energy, not just because they build the solar panels, but because they built the pipe first. It connects right back to that idea you started with, the War of Watts. While we were debating the procedural equity of a substation's location, they were moving gigawatts across the entire continent.
It feels like we've just forgotten how to do the heavy lifting. We've become obsessed with the soft side of innovation, the apps, the platforms, the financial instruments. Which brings us to another area where this loss of capacity is just painfully obvious. It's not just about building new things, it's about maintaining the ability to engineer anything at all. I want to pivot to a story that's a bit closer to home, and honestly, it's a lot sadder. I saw this thread online that was discussing the death of the Bolt. It was tracing the tragic trajectory of a veteran aerospace mechanic named Robert in Seattle. Robert spent 30 years at a giant like Boeing. He remembers the old days, the grease, the grit of the hangar floor, the smell of jet fuel. But over those 3 decades, he just watched the culture shift almost completely. He watched as the people in charge shifted from the engineers, the guys with dirty hands who actually knew how a plane stays in the air, to the sterile, spreadsheet-driven boardrooms of the financialized elite.
The bean counters, as they're affectionately known on the factory floor.
Exactly, and Robert lamented how the engineers were slowly, methodically replaced by lawyers and accountants who were focused on quarterly buybacks rather than semiconductor yield or fuselage integrity. It's a haunting narrative of deindustrialization. When I look at these stories, I see more than just a single corporate failure. I see a civilization losing its engineer-centric soul. It's a painful reminder that you cannot litigate your way into a functional physical reality. I really feel for men like Robert. There is a profound indignity in watching a society forget how to make things while pretending that innovation is just a marketing term. We've traded the wrench for the balance sheet, and the results are, well, they're literally falling out of the sky.
Robert's story is a tragedy. But for our purposes, it's a perfect diagnostic case study. It's the patient on the operating table. If we look at the research regarding Boeing, specifically the breakdown detailed in some of these deep analyses of managerism, we see a very clear shift. It's a shift from what you could call a bureaucratic financial organization, one that is run by engineers for the purpose of building great machines, to a charismatic financial organization, which is run by managers for the sole purpose of stock price optimization.
And this is what they call the inverse culture change, right? I remember reading about the merger with McDonnell Douglas. That seems to be the inflection point.
Yes, 1997. It is almost always cited as the turning point. The joke inside the company at the time was that McDonnell Douglas used Boeing's money to buy Boeing. McDonnell Douglas was failing commercially. Their planes weren't selling, but their management style was hyper-aggressive, financially driven, and obsessed with cost-cutting. And that culture, it just completely took over the engineering-first culture of old Boeing. It's often linked to the GE style of management that was popularized by Jack Welch in the 80s and 90s. The primary goal of the company shifted from product supremacy to shareholder value.
And just to clarify for everyone listening, when we say GE style, we're talking about things like stack ranking employees against each other, aggressive outsourcing to break unions and cut costs, and viewing the company not as a maker of things, but as a pool of assets to be squeezed for cash.
Exactly. It all comes down to one metric, RONA, return on net assets. That became the holy grail for management. And you have to think about what that metric actually tells you to do. It tells you to reduce your assets. Factories, machines, experienced staff on a balance sheet, those are assets. They are cost. They drag the RONA number down. So if you want to boost your RONA and get your bonus, you sell the factory and you outsource the work. You fire the expensive senior engineer with 30 years of experience and you hire a cheaper contractor. You hollow out the company to make the math look better for the next quarter.
And the physical consequences of that philosophy are they're wild. They literally moved the corporate headquarters from Seattle, where the planes are built and the engineers are, to Chicago.
And what was the reason? To be closer to Wall Street and to be on neutral ground between the different company divisions. But think about the symbolism of that move. It was a physical separation of the decision makers from the physical reality of the product. They couldn't walk down to the hangar anymore. They couldn't hear the rivet guns or talk to the mechanics. And we saw the direct result of that separation with the 737 MX. This is where that death of the Bolt concept really, really lands.
Okay, walk us through that, because most people know the 737 MX crashed, but they might not know the deep engineering history of why it was so flawed from the start.
The 737 is a legacy airframe.
Yeah.
It was designed in the 1960s. And it sits very low to the ground because back then, most airports didn't have jet bridges. People walked upstairs from the tarmac, so the plane had to be low. Fast forward 50 years. To compete with the new, fuel-efficient Airbus A320neo, Boeing needed to put new, much larger, more efficient engines on that old 737 frame. But physically, the engines didn't fit under the wing. They were just too big.
It's a classic square peg in a round hole problem.
Exactly, a pure physics problem. So their engineers had to mount the engines further forward and higher up on the wing. But that completely changed the aerodynamics of the plane. When the plane was under full thrust, like during takeoff, the new engine placement acted like a lever and pushed the nose up. The plane had a dangerous tendency to pitch up, which can lead to a stall.
Now, an engineering-first culture, the old Boeing, might have said, okay, this airframe has reached the end of its life. We need a clean sheet design, a new plane.
That's what they should have done. But a new plane takes 10 years and billions of dollars. That absolutely crushes your quarterly results and your RONA metric. A financialized culture says, fix it in software. And crucially, they didn't want to have to retrain pilots on a new type of aircraft because that costs airlines money and makes the plane less attractive to sell. So they had to make this physically compromised plane handle exactly like the old plane. They added a piece of software called MCAC, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. It was code designed to automatically force the nose of the plane down if its sensors felt the pitch was getting too high. They patched a fundamental hardware problem with a few lines of code.
That line from the source material really stuck with me. Complexity destroys information availability. They made the system so complex that even the pilots didn't fully know it was there or that it was fighting them for control of the plane.
And they did it to avoid the cost and time of full regulatory recertification. They used complexity to hide the fact that the underlying physical reality of the aircraft was broken. And this extends to the workforce itself. You mentioned Robert lamenting the loss of tribal knowledge. When you fire senior engineers to cut costs, or when you outsource critical components to dozens of dispersed suppliers to optimize RONA, you are performing a lobotomy on the collective brain of the company. You lose the guy who knows why that specific bolt has to be torqued in exactly that way, not because a manual says so, but because he saw what happened 20 years ago when someone did it wrong.
It's the difference between optimizing for a spreadsheet and optimizing for a plane that stays in the air. RONA versus reality.
And this brings us right back to the grand comparison with the East. While the West has been optimizing its assets by shedding them, going asset light as they call it, the East has been accumulating physical assets. Factories, grids, ports, raw materials processing plants. They are playing a long-term game of physical accumulation while we play a short-term game of financial extraction.
And that game of accumulation isn't just about concrete and steel anymore, is it? It's moved upstream, way, way upstream. Try to imagine a green energy transition where the keys to the entire kingdom are held by a single hand. I was researching the 15th five-year plan, and I came across a perspective of a supply chain manager in a European battery startup. And he described this moment of realization, a real holy crap moment, where he understood that every green dream his company had was actually a structural dependency on China. From the rare earth processing in Inner Mongolia to the lithium-ion gigafactories in Ningbo, the plan isn't just a document. It's the deliberate capture of the entire physical supply chain. It's a strategic masterstroke of what they call technical sovereignty. So while Western politicians are giving these grand speeches about climate goals, they are essentially ordering a future they no longer have the capacity to build themselves. I find this whole shift towards Eurasian integration both fascinating and, frankly, terrifying. As someone who values the idea of a balanced global order, seeing the West drift into a state of material illiteracy is a huge wake-up call. We are watching the transition from a world governed by legal proceduralism to one governed by whoever controls the batteries. It's a hard truth to swallow, but these stories suggest that in the 2030s, the word green might just be another word for Eastern.
That narrative hits on the absolute core of what the 15th five-year plan is all about. We need to look at this plan, which covers the period from 2026 to 2030, completely differently than we look at, say, a party platform in the West. Western media often treats these plans like political speeches, just aspirational fluff. But if you actually analyze the source text, it's not a manifesto. It is a construction schedule. And the ultimate goal is that phrase you used, technical sovereignty.
Technical sovereignty. That sounds like they don't just want to participate in the global market. They want to be completely immune to it if they have to be.
They want to be able to survive a total economic decoupling from the West. The plan openly accepts lower GDP growth. They're targeting around 4 to 5%, which is a significant slowdown for them. But in exchange for that growth, they're buying resilience. They are building what you could call a fortress economy. And the foundation of that entire fortress is the rare earth supply chain.
Right. I always hear about rare earths. And we usually think about mining, digging stuff out of the ground. But the sources we looked at suggest that's not the real choke point at all.
Correct. And that misunderstanding is the rare earth trap.
Yeah.
Western politicians and media obsess over mining rights. Oh, we found a deposit in Sweden. We found one in California. But mining is just geology. It's moving rocks. The real power, the hard part, the part that requires immense capital and engineering know-how, is in processing. It's the complex chemistry and engineering required to turn what is often a radioactive sludge into 99.99% pure usable metal.
Radioactive sludge.
Yes. Rare earth elements are almost always found in nature mixed with radioactive elements like thorium or uranium. Separating them is dirty, it's dangerous, and it is technically incredibly difficult. It's like trying to take a bowl of salt and pepper and separate the grains one by one, except the pepper is radioactive and you need $1 billion chemical plant to do it. China today controls about 85 to 90% of global processing capacity, and crucially, 99% of heavy rare earth refining.
99%, that's not a market lead, that's a functional monopoly.
It is a monopoly.
Yeah.
And it means that even if a Western mine in Australia or the US digs up the ore, they often have no choice but to ship it to China to be processed. This is because the environmental regulations and frankly the technical know-how in the West have completely atrophied over the last 30 years. The middle of the supply chain is the trap. We're like a baker who owns a wheat field, but has no mill to grind the wheat into flour.
And looking at the timelines here, it seems like we are just hopelessly behind. The research says that Western processing projects, the few that exist, won't reach any meaningful scale until maybe 2035.
And that is the strategic mismatch. The 15th five-year plan is locking in dominance now in the late 2020s. By the time these hypothetical Western projects come online in the mid-2030s, the entire market will already be defined by Eastern standards, Eastern supply chains, and Eastern pricing. And we are already seeing them begin to weaponize this dominance. The export controls they introduced back in October 2025 on rare earths and related technologies were a crystal clear signal.
That was the licensing system they set up, right? Where they can just say no to an export based on whatever they want.
Based on political alignment, it draws a red line right through the global green economy. If you are a defense contractor in the US, or a semiconductor firm in Europe, or an EV maker in a country that isn't playing ball diplomatically, your supply of dysprosium for magnets or gallium for chips might just dry up overnight. It turns supply chain management into an instrument of foreign policy.
It's statecraft disguised as simple commerce. And the very structure of their industry makes it almost impossible for Western private companies to compete. They have this mine-to-magnet vertical integration.
Right. In the West, you have a mining company, a separate chemical processing company, a magnet manufacturer, and an electric vehicle maker. They're all separate publicly traded companies. They all need to make a profit margin at every single step. They all have transaction costs. In China, under the state-directed model, those firms operate almost as a single organism. They can subsidize the dirty, unprofitable processing stage to keep magnet costs artificially low, which in turn makes their EVs cheaper, which then kills off Western competition. It's vertical integration on a national scale.
So let's take stock of the board here. We have the grid, the UHVDC lines giving them unmatched power transmission. We have the manufacturing base that we've hollowed out. We have the raw materials and the processing lockdown. Now let's talk about where all this power is going. Because there's another hungry beast that has just entered the room, and it consumes electricity like nothing we've ever seen before. Artificial intelligence.
This is where the war of watts really accelerates. We often think of AI as software, right? It's just code in the cloud. It feels ephemeral, weightless. But the cloud is actually millions of servers packed into concrete boxes, generating massive amounts of heat and consuming just biblical amounts of electricity.
Yeah.
One of the papers we analyzed calls this the AI energy nexus.
And the U.S. is clearly leading in AI right now. No core. We have the foundational models, the top talent, the most advanced silicon design.
For now, yes. But here's the catch. AI training and inference requires baseload power. That means steady, reliable electricity 204/7. You can't run a massive data center that's training a trillion parameter model on intermittent wind power unless you have absolutely massive battery storage, which, as we just discussed, is a supply chain they control. Here is the single scariest data point I saw in all the research. Since 2010, the U.S. has added, on average, about 1 gigawatt of new electricity generation capacity per year.
1 gigawatt per year.
China, over that same period, has added about 50 gigawatts per year.
1 versus 50. That's not even a race. One of those numbers is a rounding error.
It creates a massive capacity gap. And if future AI models require 10 times the compute, they are going to require 10 times the power. The location of future AI training runs might not be determined by who has the smartest coders in Silicon Valley, but by who has the raw watts to turn the servers on without crashing the regional grid.
So the entire AI revolution might just migrate to where the plugs work. And it's not just China either. The sources mention these other sovereign players. The Gulf states are throwing their hat in the ring in a big way.
Yes. Saudi Arabia with its NEOM project, the UAE with its G42 fund, these are state actors using non-market mechanisms. They don't need a utility board to approve a new power plant. They don't need to do a 15-year environmental review. They can just decide to build it. They are bypassing market logic entirely to build massive infrastructure specifically to host AI compute. So if you're Microsoft or Google and you can't get enough power in Virginia because the local utility is backed up for 5 years, but the UAE offers you a turnkey facility with cheap, unlimited solar and its own nuclear power, where do you put your next billion-dollar data center?
You go where the juice is. It's that simple. That's the sovereign advantage. But there's a really dark security angle to all this infrastructure talk, too. The dragon in the grid.
Right.
We found this report about connected devices that was just chilling.
This is the hidden layer. As our grids get smarter, they also get much more vulnerable. We are installing millions of smart devices, solar inverters, smart meters, battery management systems. A huge percentage of these are made in China because they are cheaper and, frankly, often more efficient. But these are all connected devices. They talk to the internet. And there are deep, deep concerns cited in European security briefs about backdoors being built into this hardware.
This is like the Volt Typhoon stuff we've been hearing about.
It's exactly that. Volt Typhoon is a Chinese state-sponsored hacking group that has been found by U.S. intelligence to be pre-positioning themselves inside critical American infrastructure, water systems, ports, and the power grid. The fear is a Trojan horse scenario. You buy the cheap, efficient Chinese infrastructure to power your green transition because the budget looks good. But what you've effectively done is installed a kill switch for your own energy system that a foreign adversary could trigger in the event of a conflict.
It's terrifying because it completely flips the script on efficiency. We bought the cheap gear because it made perfect economic sense, but we didn't price in the survival risk.
That is the recurring theme of this entire deep dive, isn't it? Whether it's Boeing outsourcing to save a few bucks, or the West becoming dependent on a single source for rare earths, or our utilities installing cheap inverters. We consistently prioritize short-term financial efficiency over long-term physical resilience and security. We looked at the price tag, not the provenance.
So what does this all mean? If we zoom all the way out, looking at Starmer shaking hands in Beijing, the collapse of Boeing's engineering culture, the hard numbers in the 15th five-year plan, it feels like we are witnessing the divergence of two completely different ways of being a civilization.
It's the exact divergence we talked about at the very start. The debating society versus the engineers. The West has come to view the world primarily through the lens of law, finance, and discourse, what you called the microphone. We think if we win the argument in court or structure the financial contract in a clever way, that we have won reality. The East, and increasingly these other sovereign players, view the world through physics, chemistry, and manufacturing, through the wrench.
And in a real crisis, whether it's a war, a pandemic, or the accelerating effects of climate change, you can't eat a financial derivative.
And you can't heat your home with a legal argument. The physical reality check is coming due. When the rubber finally meets the road, the civilization that can actually manipulate the physical world, move the earth, refine the metal, generate the electron, is the one that sets the terms for everyone else.
It really is a sobering reality check. The 15th five-year plan forces us to look in the mirror. We have spent decades optimizing for all the wrong things. We optimize for efficiency, for quarterly returns, for the comfort of a service economy. But history is cyclical. We are pivoting back to an era where the weight of steel, the flow of electrons, and the purity of refined metal matter more than the valuation of a stock. The civilization that remembers how to build will inherit the future. The one that only knows how to finance the builders will eventually find itself living in a house it doesn't own, with lights it can't turn on.